Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Spooky shit that happened to you. Okay, so we all know skinwalkers in the woods, ghosts in abandoned hotels, houses, apartment complex, and alien probing your Uranus Greentext stories, most of which are fictional. How about you tell some shit that you actually experienced in your daily life which was super creepy?
I have plenty, but one of the spookiest shit is back when I saw something akin to a werewolf or a shapeshifter when I was a kid. Sounds like bullshit, but bear with me. Be in the countryside far from town. The house runs out of water for some reason I don't remember. Have to clean the dishes at an outdoor sink after dinner. Said sink was quite a few meters away from the house, so enough light to barely see while making the surroundings pitch black. Reached the sink, finished washing everything, and was ready to go. Suddenly hear a growl coming from the woods a few steps away from me. See what it seems to be a dog, but it's so dark I can't even tell what breed it is or if it's even a dog at all. It looked more like a sort of shadow in the form of a dog. Slowly started to back away in confusion as the dog shifted into the shadow of man. It kept growling at me, but now with a human voice, as if he was trying to imitate a dog, all the while standing still and shifting between a man and a dog. At one point it seemed like it was both things at once, but it kept shifting over and over. I kept walking backwards without getting my eyes off of it, and I ran to the house once I got far enough from the woods. Look back. Nothing. Of course, logically no one believed me. Not even to this day, and I never expect people to do so. When I asked around, that place had a few bizarre stories, but nothing about werewolves or shit like that. Still, I'm sure it was real, but I don't remember being that scared, mostly because my brain was too busy trying to process what was happening. It's still hard to describe. If I were to describe it, looking at the shifting was like seeing something that distorts and overlaps over itself while still being two different things at the same time. Really confusing.
Werewolf. A girl I used to work with about 15 years ago told me her brother encountered a werewolf, or something similar. They lived in Bury near Manchester in England, and I don't know the area, unfortunately. Apparently, this large pitch-black thing that resembled a dog chased her brother and some of his mates through a wooded area. They reached the end of the path they were being chased along and climbed a chain fence at the end of it, her brother being the last one over. When they got down the other side and looked back at it, it stood upright at the fence like a man. I think she said it was well over 6 feet tall. When their mom came to do the laundry, she found 3 big cuts down the front of the brother's shirt like from an animal's claws. I've never really had anything spooky happen to me, aside from seeing a big fuck-off Great Dane-looking dog staring at me through the trees in a local forest. I told it to fuck off back to its owner. There was a dead body field in the same forest though. It was an open area with tall grass, no trees, and overlooked a housing estate. It smelled horrible there, and after going there once our group of friends avoided it from then on. We called it a dead body field because it smelled like something had died up there, but we never actually found anything.
This is the only paranormal experience I've had outside of creepy sleep paralysis and shadow men. This happened on the night of the 31st of December going into the new year of 2017. Now, I don't know if you remember, but near the end of 2016, there was a lot of discussion over whether we live in a computer simulation. I've never been a full believer, but the logic of if it is possible, then odds are that we are in one made sense to me at the time, as I was not religious. This is important to note, as on the night of December 31st, 2016, I felt something that I can only compare as a computer reboot. I'll go into details as to what exactly I experienced. I got home from my New Year's party early at around 10 p.m. I didn't stay long because I didn't really feel like it that year. I did some 8chan browsing for a bit and then went to bed. Now, I don't know when I woke up, but it was still as dark as it was when I went to bed. Initially, I woke up and was completely lucid, not feeling tired at all and fully aware of my surroundings. However, I could not move an inch. I don't remember if I was able to blink or not. Nothing happened for a while. I just thought it was strange I couldn't move, but I've had sleep paralysis in the past, so at the moment I just assumed that's what was happening. After a few minutes, I heard a shutdown sound. Not shut down from your computer, but more like the sound of a machine powering off with a swoosh. Then nothing for maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Then I started having a ringing in my ears that increased in intensity over 20 seconds. Sounded like the sound you hear when you have tinnitus, but extremely loud. At the same time as the ringing started, progressively my vision started getting brighter and brighter. Not the lighting in the room, but more like if you had a low-intensity flashlight pointed into your eyes that would ramp up in brightness until I wasn't able to see anything but white with rectangular shapes moving in a circular pattern in the brightness. If that makes sense. At this point, my heart was racing, and the only thought I remember going through my head was holy shit. Those theories about us living in a computer simulation were real. And they're shutting off the simulation going into 2017. Everyone else on Earth must be going through this right now. Then, the brightness stopped at once, however now it was like I had completely lost my sight. I couldn't see my room anymore. The only thing I could see at this point was those rectangles moving in the circular pattern, and I was able to notice they had a blue tint. Eventually this went away too, leaving me with simply seeing nothing. I remember wanting to get out of my bed and move around at this point, but again I had no control over my body. The last thing I remember is remaining in this state, which is what I imagine being blind is like. I assume sleep took me after a while. I woke up the next morning, and the first thing I did was get up and go talk about the experience with my dad. We lived together. However, he hadn't been home from the party until 4 in the morning and barely slept. I talked about it with a few people shortly after it happened, and no one had felt this. Usually people would ask me if I drank on that night, which I did, and they'd say that's what caused it. However, I didn't drink a lot. I was able to drive home just fine. To this day, I haven't heard about anyone experiencing something like this. The closest would be alien abductions, and while I'm not very knowledgeable on the subject and while it is similar to what people report, as far as I could tell everything happened within my room and I wasn't taken anywhere. Has anyone here experienced something like this, or heard about something like this before?
There's a small room, well, more of a niche, in the basement of my parents' place that invariably would make my skin crawl whenever I passed by it. Again, the room itself is nothing impressive. It's barely 16 square feet across. And the only thing inside it was the water pump of the house, as well as various stuff that more or less got dumped there. Old toys, gardening stuff, etc. At any rate, for the longest time I thought that it was the sound of the pump itself that scared me. Bear in mind it's a fairly old model going back to, hells if I know. Might as well have been there when the house was first built, and that was back in the 50s. Anyway, I rationalized my fear as somehow stemming from the pump itself. Some sort of infrasound perhaps. Cue my grandmother who also lived in the house passing away, and my parents decided to do a bit of house cleaning grandma invariably would have objected to. Hey, turns out grandma has been keeping the leg prosthesis of my grandfather boxed away in that room. Never mind, he's died some 30 years before her. It's obviously not the same as having a literal skeleton in the closet, and I don't know if my grandmother intentionally kept that thing as a memento, or if she simply forgot about it. And while it's not the proverbial skeleton in the closet, I'm no longer sure it was the water pump that gave off the nasty vibe.
This one is far-fetched even by the standards of X, but here goes. When I was still in elementary school in the 4th grade, to be exact, our class went on a school trip to a nearby youth hostel. Now, the school trip in itself really was nothing special, and the strange event I want to bring up only occurred on the very last afternoon we spent at the hostels, when everyone was more or less sitting on packed bags and ready to take the bus back home the next morning. Now, the youth hostel itself was neatly nestled against some densely wooded hills, with nothing more than a grassy playground with soccer goals, monkey bars, and the likes between it and the trees. And considering it would be my last chance, the little smartass that was me decided I'd be going to explore these woods for a little bit. So it simply marched off, and at first, the thicket wasn't all that impressive. It was just your usual, Middle European deciduous forest in early autumn, full of trees, yellowing leaves, and dead branches on the ground. The actual anomaly was the burn smell I suddenly noticed at some point deeper in the woods. I genuinely had and have no idea what caused it. There was no smoke anywhere, and while my country does get the occasional forest fire, the temperatures on that were far too mild to cause one. Being a stupid kid, I promptly deduced that I was nearing some kind of hobo's fireplace or whatnot, and ran my scared ass back to the hostel. Didn't talk about it with anyone, and was well on my way back home the day after. My parents picked me up once I was back in my hometown. While inside the car, my mother had asked me if I had heard the news, and when I replied I had not, she explained something terrible had happened in America. Some terrorists apparently had crashed planes into the World Trade Centers. Or to put it differently, I came back on September 12th, 2001, and the day when I suddenly was overcome by this strong burning smell was 9/11. I'm still pretty convinced this really was a mere coincidence. Not to mention the time difference between New York and my country is about 6 hours New York UTC 5, my country UTC +1. So if the first plane crashed into the North Tower at 8:46 local time, it should have been around 14:46 in my time zone, and I remember it was in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m. when I went exploring, but the strange coincidence of dates still spooked me pretty good once I realized how they added up.
A lot of paranormal things happened at my old house out in the sticks. I always chalked it up to my childhood imagination until my mother corroborated a lot of the events. It was mostly average occurrences. Electronic toys acting up on their own and making weird noises, sometimes even without batteries up in the attic. Noises we thought were animals on the roof or in the walls. Items going missing and showing up in my closet, which seemed to be some kind of hot spot. It had an entrance going into the attic. I would sometimes have nightmares and sleep paralysis episodes where this dried, burnt figure with orange glowing eyes would stand at the foot of my bed and retreat into the closet whenever I moved. I say figure because the eyes were freakishly large and it had vaguely human proportions. No other features were on its face. It would turn into a shadow and bounce around the room furiously before going back in. I don't know how I fell asleep. I think it's because as a child I was basically gaslit into thinking nightmares and imagination were just this vivid for everyone. The few times I looked at the clock after waking, it was 3 a.m. Another thing that was fucked was the tapping. I had 2 very large windows in my room, and there was a time where I'd hear tapping on one of them in the evening when I was alone. It wasn't the rapping of a bird's beak on glass, more like a finger. I'd peer out the blinds and recoil when it started again. I almost chased the noise outside once when it first started because I thought it was my father. He had recently left my mom on bad terms. I thought he wanted to sneak me out. Fortunately, I checked the driveway first and saw no car. My mother only heard it once and promptly hit the window, believing it to be an animal. This memory would eventually creep her out, but only for reasons she filled me in on as a teen. Turns out she was seeing this guy in town and he was kind of shady, showing up at random times at our house or her work. There was one time we were curled up on the couch in the living room watching the Jirachi movie on VCR when we heard a cell phone go off outside. My mother immediately called the cops, and I never knew why until she explained the context to me years later. That window would eventually be removed, not because it was spooky, but because it broke during a fight I had with my cousin. My mom took it out and promised a replacement soon, but a single mother living 40 minutes away from the nearest hardware store can't often find time or money between work and school. I went a couple of weeks with nothing but a sheet tacked over it before my grandfather found out and threw a fit. Those nights I had to go lights out after dark or else I would get lots of bugs. And I mean lots. If you've ever seen a porch light out here in Florida, you'd know how many hundreds of insects can accumulate there. I fell asleep once with my ceiling light on and woke up to something biting me and bugs covering the walls and ceiling. I'm talking about every variety imaginable. Some huge. I developed a fear for insects touching me after that. There was another time the neighbor's horse broke the fence and decided to stick its head in my window like it was a stall door. I guess the wind blew down the sheet and this thing expected some oats. I woke up to something large snorting in the darkness and screamed. This spooked the horse and it thrashed before ducking out. My mother quickly ran in and shone the flashlight around until we saw the painted mare still wandering around in the yard looking very contemptuous. This incident is how my grandfather found out actually. Fun times all around.
The house I grew up in had pretty active poltergeist activity, although we were the only people who had lived there since it was built. Supposedly, most of the area was built on Indian burial grounds. There were constant noises throughout the night, feeling like you were being watched, etc. My brother had even crazier things happen, like straight-up shadow figures and apparitions. Here are the 3 memories that I remember most vividly. Be me, night owl. Go to the kitchen for a drink at like 3 a.m. As you turn the corner into the kitchen, you are facing the garage door. The garage door knob has been broken so it doesn't latch shut. Aki, you can push the door open without turning the handle. As soon as I turn the corner, the garage door is being pulled open, as if someone pulled the door from the other side as far as it would go and then released it so it slammed shut. Pitch black nothingness on the other side as the door slams closed. Stand there paralyzed with fear, knowing that only me and my brother are home. Wait for what felt like an eternity for him to come out the other side. Get the fight or flight fear coursing through my veins and run the fuck out of there full speed. When I worked up the courage to check a little while later, my brother was passed out in his bed and no windows or anything were open. A few months later, putting leftover food down the garbage disposal around 3 a.m. again. Dump food, flip switch and turn on sink. As soon as the garbage disposal starts loudly spinning, I feel what can only be described as an angry person running up and crowding behind me. Feel a jolt of energy shoot through my body. All of the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up like an electric charge. Suddenly get the overwhelming feeling of terror and run the fuck out of there again. A few years later, Dad moved in with his GF and brother moved out of state. I am living in the house until it is sold and taking care of my brother's cat. Would always hear shit moving around while in bed at night. Figure it was cat knocking shit around or whatever. Brother moves to a new apartment and brings his dog and takes the cat since they didn't allow dogs or something. Chilling with dog bro now alone in the house. First night, hearing the same noises. It sounds like a Tupperware bowl is being knocked across the floor, but constantly, as if a cat was playing with it. The time is 3 a.m. The dog is right next to me staring down the dark hallway with a look of concern. There is no greater feeling of absolute fear and dread than being alone in a house and hearing something like that in the darkness.
Just today, I was walking back home around 7 p.m. when I was hit by a pretty nasty downpour. To be fair, it had been raining more or less non-stop all day. But while most of it was nothing a good jacket couldn't handle, it suddenly started pouring to the point my jeans were soaking wet in 2 minutes flat. To add insult to injury, this being mid-autumn meant the sun was pretty much gone by that point, and the dense clouds above only worsened things. I'm half walking, half running down the street when I notice a person on the sidewalk some feet ahead to me. It's seriously dark at this point, so the only thing I can make out is that the figure is facing a nearby house, with its back turned to me. I just assumed it's another guy surprised by the rain, but as soon as I blinked, the figure was gone. My first thought was that I had seen nothing more than my own shadow. Except that doesn't make sense because there wasn't any light source to cast such a shadow. Said shadow would not have simply popped out of existence, and the figure I saw very certainly was three-dimensional, in the sense that it wasn't just a projection cast across the pavement, but a solid object with a clear-cut outline.
We always hear about ghosts staying behind to mess with the living world due to some sort of unfinished business, such as passing on information, fighting demons, harassing trespassers, or straight up cursing people. In that case, why aren't there more combat ghosts? More often than not, when somebody dies fighting for something they are really concerned with succeeding in that pursuit, it stands to reason that some of the more passionate individuals would be less than willing to simply fade away, and like their civilian kin would work to assist their living comrades, such as by reconnaissance, psychological warfare, or assassination. Do you think that battlefields are as chaotic on the spectral plane as they are on the mundane? For every squad of meat sacks trying to make ghosts, there is a platoon of existing conducting intelligence operations against the enemy and counterintelligence operations against the enemy's team of ghosts.
According to traditional ghost lore, most spirits seem to be physically bound to a place that was somehow meaningful to them, be it their former homes, the graveyard where their mortals' remains are buried, or perhaps even the battlefield upon which they died. In much of the same tact, ghosts seem to have a relatively hard time manipulating objects in the physical world, with most of their activity being confined to short pushes and shoves. That being said, there also are multiple stories about ghosts that keep fighting their last fight ad infinitum. They say both Union and Confederate ghosts are still continuing the battle at Gettysburg. Britain itself has multiple locations where you supposedly can see Roman ghosts marching straight past you.
Britain has a fairly rich history of Roman ghosts, specifically Roman legionaries prancing about left and right, often in whole armies. And Gettysburg likewise is supposed to see continued fighting between Union and Confederate spirits. Why there's not more of them is up for debate. For the modern age, one possible explanation might be that actually becoming a ghost actively requires you to believe in ghosts, in the sense that, if you don't, you flatly come to accept that there's nothing more you can do in your doing moments, as opposed to the notion you might still have your vengeance from beyond the grave. An interesting question would be whether or not soldiers suffering a very quick or instant death, for example by headshot, have a lower or higher chance of keeping on fighting on the other side, in the sense they flatly don't realize they died.
More to the K-point, haunted guns would be easy to detect, easy to prove, but hard to notice at random. Unlike most potential supernatural events, which involve people, large objects, distant sounds, or unobserved movements, a haunted gun could be characterized by massive differences in outcome from minimal force. Due to rifling action and the extremely regularized nature of bullets and barrels, bullets almost never deviate from a straight, normal trajectory, only accounting for curvature and gravity over huge distances. A ghost even slightly nudging a bullet with the force of a gnat on the way out of the barrel could cause a visible deviation in final contact, the shape of hole or location, that could be forensically verified. This goes for people claiming to be psychics as well. Any power over metal at all, no matter how weak, could make a huge, demonstrable difference in bullet trajectory if you're aiming for 300 yards. That's all hard to notice at random because very rarely are old guns taken to the range, and people dismiss improbable deviations as bad aim or wind all the time, even where that makes little sense. In my opinion, if anything is haunted at all, guns would be a top contender. I'm kind of surprised the military never considered this. They invested a lot into psychic combat, i.e., the use of the mind to affect the disposition of consciousness of any target, but there is no study of using the mind to bend a real bullet's trajectory, like for target-seeking bullets. That's despite their interactions with Uri Geller, and affecting objects was his whole shtick. It's possible that research is still classified, but I kinda doubt it.
What if the gun itself was possessed? Imagine the gun firing without you pulling the trigger because there's someone in its sights it doesn't like.
Pulling a trigger is a good amount of force, but there's always been the thought of misfires, so who's to say? It's almost totally unstudied, as far as I know. Uri Geller worked with the military and CIA as part of a relatively small facet of the psychic warfare studies of the Cold War. He was brought in for a demonstration, studied for a week after he convinced them he had psychic powers, and collaborated with intelligence operatives in the years that followed. It's hard to say how much of the study was people in on the joke or true believers rigging it for success, but taking his results at face value, he proved that he was somewhere in the space between psychically capable doing the impossible and psychically competent, doing the impossible reliably. The conclusions of administrators of the time was that he was not reliable enough to turn it into an active and useful program, not that he did not demonstrate any psychic powers. Ultimately, mounting concerns that Uri had instead successfully conned people into giving him answers and information, on purpose or on accident, led to the whole thing getting canned. Noteworthy addition, I do not believe he was ever evaluated on spoon bending or physical telekinesis, which is bizarre, because that was his most public trick. Likely they knew it was a trick, and focused on what they perceived as authentic unexplainable events under his most obvious con, but I think that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Telekinesis would be the most provable and potentially the most useful psychic power, or way to interact with ghosts. As previously discussed, imagine, for example, you knew gunshots reliably swerved to target the gun owner's murderers' heads. If you needed to assassinate a dictator, wouldn't arming the entire squad with their victims' firearms, or their murder weapons, be a massive advantage? Would coincidences start to line up just right to make the mission a success? Likewise, if psychics can curve bullets, would a squad of LaFox men do the job better than trained shooters? Due to the fragility of the physical forces involved, how intimate guns are with death, and how regularized firing procedures are, it seems like a really good target for detecting minimal or weak supernatural activity of any kind.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember that all videos have been archived on the Odyssey page.